I sighed, sinking into the patio chair. I loved this time of day, especially here at home. It was so quiet and peaceful as I sat on the patio and sipped my coffee. I could hear the birds chirping and see them flitting around, living their lives to the fullest. It was Indian summer, my favorite time of year. I could still wear shorts and short-sleeved shirts. I relaxed in bliss, watching the sun come out from behind the big hill to the east of my house. I watched the sun illuminate the silhouettes of the 70-year-old trees in my yard and along the creek that gurgled merrily down the road past my house and yard. The shade and cool air made my patio and yard a little piece of heaven. It was so peaceful to look at the creek. Thinking back to my childhood, I remembered living, working, and playing in these parts. The land was such a part of me. This farm has been in my family for over 100 years, and I hoped it would remain in the family even after my death. I remembered the hours spent in the old swimming hole in the corner of the yard. So many of my friends came to swim and play that sometimes my mom thought she had a daycare center instead of a family. How many meals did we cook on the built-in grill next to the old swimming hole and then eat at the table next door? How many kisses did I steal while sitting or lying on blankets by the creek? I thought of Susan, my first friend and years later my wife. A tear ran down my cheek at that memory. My teeth gritted and my stomach clenched again with anger as my thoughts shifted from her to my best friend Timothy. The coffee I had enjoyed turned acidic and sour in my stomach. Back then, the three of us were inseparable. Timothy and I competed for Susan's attention for several years until I won, and we became a solid couple. I cried silently at the memory, feeling the emptiness inside, the all-consuming loneliness of having the big house and 600-acre farm now at my disposal. My farming, investments, and other interests could not fill the void created after my family was taken from me. I asked myself again what I had done to make it happen. As I remembered the pain, a cloud obscured the sun breaking through the trees, and I felt the first chill of fall, a chill as deep and soul-destroying as the one I carried within me. I was alone, age 35, recently divorced, my children Jessica, 11, and Alexander, 10, taken from me by an insensitive court, an ex-wife, and a former friend. Would this have happened if I hadn't stayed in the reserves and been drafted into the last Iraq War? Was that the reason I lost my family, or would Tim have won in the end anyway? I knew that as the years went by, Susan became more and more dissatisfied with her position in life. But to be like this? I knew she wanted to be the wife of a more significant person, but I wasn't and couldn't be that person. I thought that surely our love would come through. I sighed and got up to drink another cup of my morning elixir, my special blend of coffee that I brewed daily, rain or shine. I knew that dwelling on my problems didn't solve them, but what was a man to do? I went back to my shelter and sat down again to watch the creek in the south field. I loved watching my cattle feeding on the lush grass, and the mist rising from the creek and hanging in the morning sunlight, partially blocking my view. The soft mooing of my animals and the sounds of the neighbors' tractors relaxed me. The sound of the water hitting the rocks in the rapids before entering the deep hole we were swimming in pleased me. I was as calm as I could possibly be given my recent divorce. I sighed and leaned back in my chair to remember happy times again. My parents and their loving exuberance, laughter, and the parties we used to throw here in the backyard. Ah, times were so good, so carefree with family and friends laughing and playing and swimming in the hot weather. I could almost feel Susan behind me, and then I realized that never again would I feel her come up behind me on that patio and put her hand on my shoulder, leaning in to kiss me. Never again will I feel her slender body shuddering in orgasm as we make love on this patio or on our double bed. Shit! Another tear rolled down my cheeks. I have to pull myself together. Happy times were so closely associated with this yard and house. I remembered the summer when Susan first refused to take a dip in the water with Tim and me. That summer we realized that she was truly a different and perhaps fascinating creature. We tormented her mercilessly that year and the years that followed. At the time, romance was out of the question, and as we grew older, we started dating other people. Susan would sometimes run around with me, sometimes with Tim, but I don't think either of us considered it dating her. Finally, the summer after high school graduation, I started dating my friend Susan. At first, we just took our friends somewhere to have fun and socialize because we both didn't have people close to us. One day, my parents weren't home and Susan came over for a swim. We played and dunked each other like when we were young, and then as we were wrestling in the creek, her top came off. She gasped and I just stared at her. Finally, I tore my gaze away from her beautiful breasts and looked into her eyes. Her face was crimson, but there was a strange expression on it. We slowly leaned toward each other, and I kissed her gently. I don't know how long we held each other and kissed, but by mutual consent, without saying a word, I led her from the bathhouse to the house. On the way, we stopped several times to kiss and touch each other. Finally, we came to the entrance of the hallway. She ran down the hall to my bedroom, and I followed her. The excitement and fear that I would do something wrong or hurt her was almost overwhelming. Susan led me through the most exciting and heavenly afternoon. "Don't worry, John. I'm on the pill," she said. A day or two later, I didn't even think about the fact that it obviously wasn't the first time she'd had sex either. I was so hurt the next time I saw her, and she confessed that good old Timothy had possessed her cherry almost a year ago. She looked at me in surprise at my upset and said, "John, I'm not an easy target, but so what if it wasn't the first time? So what if there were two before you? Does it matter?" I decided then that it didn't matter to me, but now I wonder if it should have. At the end of that summer, we enrolled in community college and were together for the first year. During the summer, I felt drawn to the world and gave in to my secret fantasy. I had always dreamed of military service, so I enlisted in the Army. I served my allotted time and came home as a sergeant. Susan stayed at the college while I was away. I tried to get her to promise to wait for me, but she only smiled and stroked my face affectionately, saying, "Oh, John, you know how much I love you. How could you think I would ever forget you?" I wrote to Susan for almost a year before she wrote to me and told me that she had met a man and wanted to date him. After my letter to Dear John, I never heard from her again and lost contact with her. I heard that she was dating the guy she dumped me for and a few others, but I didn't try to keep track of her. Eventually, we broke up. On my second day at home, I was walking down the street and saw Susan. I remember how my heart trembled when I recognized her. When I called her name, her face lit up with that wonderful smile I remembered. The whole day seemed brighter as I watched her smile and chat with me. I felt myself weakening as she touched my arm to emphasize her point. Walking over to her, I examined her left hand. Oh God, I remember thinking. No rings. I invited her to a local cafe for coffee and was so glad when she accepted. We spent the afternoon talking. I learned that the man she had left me for had only been with me for 3 months. She said she was so ashamed of what she had done that she never got up the courage to write me again. Susan told me that he was a senior in graduate school, and she was so enamored with his manners and knowledge and his outlook that she just had to date him. He was from one of the best families in the neighboring big city and drove a nice car, but she found that he was just a flash. He had a wandering look in his eyes. I still remember comforting her as she cried and saying, "Oh, John, I was such a fool. I left the most wonderful and considerate man in the world for such a jerk." She dated Tim for a while, but according to her, they did not get along. She is now in her last year of college and lives at home. When she told me that she wasn't seeing anyone else at the time, I was so happy. I begged and pleaded until I convinced her to go out to dinner with me that night. Over the next few months, I pursued Susan relentlessly. The first time I asked her to marry me, she refused, and I was crushed. I redoubled my efforts and continued to pursue her. Finally, the second time I asked her to marry me, Susan sighed and said yes. We were married on Christmas Eve and never looked back. Or rather, I didn't look back until this spring. I now wish I had taken her no to my first proposal as my final answer, but then I wouldn't have had my 2 wonderful children. I went back to college and majored in agribusiness with a minor in mathematics. Along the way, I participated in the Army ROTC program and got my commission. I chose to serve in the reserves and life was so good. We were so in love with each other. I still loved the Army, but now it was competing with Susan for my time. She complained about my time in the reserves, and I complained about having to be away from her, but I couldn't give it up. It was in my blood to sing a duet along with my love for Susan. After college and basic officer training, Susan wasn't too happy when I came home and started running the household. She wanted me to stay on active duty or find a job in the city. I thought I had convinced her that what I was doing was the right thing for me and for us. Shortly after I returned home, Susan became pregnant with Jessica. And a year later, Alex came along. We were living the American dream, I thought. Then the second war in Iraq started. My unit was drafted into the Army. By this time, I was already a captain and commander of an engineer sapper company. I loved my job and my men and was proud to be going. But Susan was tearing my heart out, begging me to give up the trip. I remember the last night home when she clung to me and cried herself to sleep. She just couldn't understand that this was the price for freedom and that it was part of who I was. a job like farming or anything else I could do. I was a citizen soldier and a farmer. She could only see how my leaving would affect her and the children. She complained that I was abandoning them. I agonized, but I had no choice. I knew Susan was hurt and upset, but I couldn't believe her behavior. When I called, she was withdrawn and didn't talk for long periods of time. I hardly received any emails, nor did I receive a few packages from the kids. I rented out the land to Timothy while I was away so she wouldn't have to do the farming thing. The next year shouldn't have been too hard on her, but I certainly got a portion of the guilt for how hard it was without me at home. About 3 months after I arrived in the country, I received a letter from Susan. She informed me that she had found a job at the grain elevator as a clerk. Susan told me not to try to call her at home during the day or bother her at work as she was very busy. She was so pleased and proud. She said Tim took pity on her for staying home alone all day and found a place for her. I found out later that he had indeed found a place for her. A couple months after Susan told me about her new job, Jessica mentioned in one of her letters that Tim and Susan had been out on a walk in town, and her mother came in drunk and crying. I tried to call Susan but couldn't, so I wrote her a letter asking her to tell me how it really was. I never got a reply, but when Jessica wrote me again, she told me that she had gotten in trouble for bothering me by telling me about her mother's activities, and that Susan had told her never to mention such things again because she didn't want me to worry. I was worried, but I trusted Susan, so I eventually decided that she was just so embarrassed to get drunk that she wanted to hide it from me. Then that day came. We were supposed to move our base of operations and were in a convoy of vehicles when our luck ran out. My car was hit by an improvised explosive device. My driver was killed and I was severely wounded. I had a broken left leg, several broken ribs, and received a penetrating wound to my right thigh and chest. I was in Iraq for 10 months and was not able to return home until 17 months later. My wife and children never visited me in the hospital, and I received very few letters and cards. I had no other relatives because my parents died about 6 years ago within a few months of each other. Once in a while I would call home, but the kids were withdrawn and I never got to talk to Susan. She was either at work or in a meeting. Every once in a while one of the kids would mention that she and Mr. Geithner, her boss Timothy, had gone out to dinner or to some social event. I never got an answer to my questions and began to worry. Finally, I was released from active duty and allowed to come home. I was so happy and excited. I called my kids and asked them to ask their mom to pick me up at the airport. And to be safe, I emailed the flight number and arrival time. I remembered the panting and the blurred vision as I looked down at my home neighborhood as the plane came in for a landing. I couldn't wait to see my wife and family and hug them one more time. I looked and looked but couldn't see them in the arrivals hall. Finally, as I was leaving the baggage claim area, I saw a man in a nice suit holding a sign with my name on it. "I'm Captain John Stevens." "What can I do for you?" I asked. He looked at me, pulled a picture out of his pocket, and nodded. He handed me the plate and I saw that it was actually a fully filled legal envelope with my name written on the outside with a magic marker. "Sir, you have been served with a notice. This envelope contains a petition for divorce between your wife Susan and you. It also contains a restraining order prohibiting you from coming within 1,000 feet of your home, wife, and children. You are also prohibited from having any contact with them, including phone calls and/or mail. Have a good day, sir." He looked at me, shook his head, and walked away. I walked to the nearest chair and sat down, gasping in shock and pain, trying to decide what to do. A sob escaped my throat and my eyes were watering. I was overcome with anger. I decided to call Tim and ask him to come get me. He wouldn't answer the phone at home, and when I called his store, they told me he was busy and couldn't be disturbed. I remember sitting staring into space, tears streaming down my cheeks. I was crying silently. People looked at me as they passed by. Finally, a security guard came up to me and asked, "Sir, are you all right? Do you need a doctor or a priest?" I looked at the guard and shook my head. No. I just walked away from a herd of doctors, and another one can't cure what ails me right now. I'm coming home from Iraq, and instead of meeting me and taking me home, my wife sent a bailiff with divorce papers. What the hell do you think a doctor or priest can do for me? By this time, a small group of people had surrounded us, and when they heard this, there was such a gasp that you would have thought there was a leak at the airport. The security guard looked so uncomfortable that I even felt sorry for him. As I sat with my hands on my legs and my head hanging down, a stout gentleman of about 50 years of age squeezed through the crowd. The gentleman sat down next to me and said, "Excuse me, Captain. I think you should come with me while you decide what to do next. I can't welcome you home like a loving family would, or like you expected or even deserved, but at least come along and let me buy you a drink while you come to terms with this situation." This gracious gentleman gently helped me up from my chair and directed me to the airport lounge. As we walked, he introduced himself. He said he was an attorney and a reserve colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. "If you don't have a personal attorney to help you sort out this mess, I would be honored to represent you." This is one of the most disgusting things I have ever seen, and I want to help you settle this case as quickly and painlessly as possible. Since I didn't have a lawyer, I saw no reason not to let him handle the case. He bought me a drink while I let him read the petition. He wrote a statement that I had to sign authorizing him to act on my behalf and told me to expect new papers in the mail in the next day or two. After all legal matters were settled, Josh, Mr. Joshua Roundtree, my attorney, waited until I found my way home before shaking my hand and leaving. I had to make several calls before I finally found one of my friends at home. When he found out who was calling and what I needed, he said, "Oh shit, John. You're kidding me. She really left you at the airport and didn't even let your kids pick you up? God, I'm really sorry, man. Stay at the bar and have a couple more cool ones until I get there. You know it'll take me an hour and a half to get there, but I'll be right by your side." I remembered sitting alone, seemingly much longer than it had been, waiting for Sam to pick me up. When I saw him standing in the doorway of the bar, I stood up and walked uncertainly toward him. All I could do was carry my bag and get my bearings. Sam looked at me and shook his head. "I'm really sorry, John. Now come on and we'll get you home." On the way back to our hometown, Sam told me about Susan. He said that she got very angry when I left and accused me of abandoning her and the children. She complained about me to everyone in town who would listen, until most people just walked away when they saw her. The only one of our old friends who wasn't upset with her was Tim. They started going out together more and more often to different places. Eventually, she started working in the office, and even a little later they were seen at dinner, dances, and generally as a couple. Those who could afford it went about their business elsewhere when it became known that Susan was spending time in Tim's bed. I was offered a place to stay with Sam and his wife Joan in town. Friends and neighbors kept the door open for the next few days, dropping in on me and telling me what was going on while I was away. The only thing most of them didn't want to talk about was Susan. The most I could manage was a sentence or two, after which they either changed the subject or remembered they had to go. Finally, one day I was at the bank and turned around to see Susan coming through the door. I stopped in shock looking at her face, then my gaze fell on her belly. She was very pregnant. When she saw me, her face turned white, then turned dark red, and she ran out of the building. I stood and stared, feeling like a fool. And then I noticed the silence in the building and saw that almost everyone was looking at me. I turned around and walked outside too. I was standing by my truck when I felt a hand on my back. I heard a woman's voice. "John, are you okay?" I looked in the direction of the voice and saw one of my favorite teachers from high school. She instilled in me a love of math and spent hours taking me to an even higher level of knowledge than the school offered. I smiled and said, "Yes, I guess so, Miss Maud. How are you?" Miss Maud smiled slightly and said with a certain amount of acerbity, "Well, boy, I guess you're a little better than you are now. You know the whole town is proud of you and most of us are sorry for what you're going through. If you need to talk, you know where I live, son?" She hugged me lightly and walked back into the bank. I couldn't believe no one had told me Susan was pregnant. I know I had only been home for 3 days, but damn. I knew now that there was no way we could ever get back together. I was almost certain before, but now, no way. The divorce was long and bitter. During the hearings, Susan and I were warned a couple of times about contempt of court when we got into altercations. During one of her tirades, she told me that one of the reasons she was divorcing me was because I would never accomplish anything and she needed more for herself and the children. She told me that Tim had accomplished a lot and would be able to provide for her and the kids. I just stared at her in shock. Tim only had 140 acres of land, and although he ran a farm store, he only owned 25%. However, he liked to run a big strip through town, and there was talk of him running for the State House of Representatives. He was always flamboyant, and I suppose that and his smooth lines is what ultimately led her to victory. I now wish I had paid more attention to her when we were younger, and she was always running with Tim. It seemed to me that even when we were together, she spent a lot of time with Tim, but I just wrote it off as friendship. We seemed to fight about everything. I didn't think I was unreasonable, but she said I was unreasonable. She wanted the house and half the farm, 3/4 of the bank accounts, and full custody of the kids. I was able to keep the whole farm to myself, but it wasn't easy. To keep the land, I had to give her all but $10,000 of our savings and a promissory note for almost $200,000. I was very pleased that the 2 real estate agents we had brought in to appraise the place were also unhappy with the way she had treated me. They appraised it at $1,500 an acre instead of the $2,250 it probably would have sold for. I was afraid the judge would disagree when she and Tim complained, but we had a trump card up our sleeve. About a year before, one of our neighbors had financial difficulties and quickly sold the property for $1,250/acre, so the judge allowed $1,500/acre to be used as a reasonable appraisal. Tim was so angry that he was escorted out of the hearing swearing and yelling. Finally, yesterday it was over. In my 35 years, I was single and alone again, unless you count a town full of friends. Susan had gotten custody of the kids, but I had unlimited visitation rights and was guaranteed at least 1 weekend a month and 2 months in the summer. With another heavy sigh, I got up to face the day. The first day of the rest of my life, a life without the woman I loved so much. It wasn't going to be easy for a while, but I was sure I could get through it like I had gotten through Iraq and the wounding. I wondered if it would hurt as much as it had then. Susan and Tim got married 2 weeks after their divorce was finalized and moved into his house on 140 acres of land. I was able to keep the kids for the week they took for their honeymoon. At least the kids were close enough that I could see them daily if I wanted to. In fact, often they would get off the school bus at my house and stay there until Tim and Susan got home from work. The last 6 years flew by like a blink of an eye. I was still single, but I had a semblance of a good life. I had my children and their love. I had good friends, both male and female, but no girlfriend. For almost a year and a half, I didn't date, but I did attend some local events, dances, pie dinners, etc. I finally started going on occasional dates, but never could find anyone who would ignite that particular spark. I dated a lot of very nice ladies, but never found anyone special. Truth be told, I had one new interest. I lived only 2 miles out of town, and I had a large, almost new barn that I used only partially for parking my equipment. About 5 years ago, I was listening around town and observing my neighbors. It seemed like a lot of people were shopping for a farm out of town, rather than at Tim's store. I started asking questions, and most of the answers boiled down to 2 reasons why people leave town. One was the price and quality of Tim's goods, and the other was their disgust at the way he and Susan treated me. I decided to compete with Tim and open my own farm supply and feed store. To help, I hired a young married couple who lived a 1/4 mile from me. Sean handled the feed and merchandise, and Sally worked the cash register and helped do the bookkeeping. I did a little bit of everything, including running the farm. I also stayed in the Army Reserves and did a few short tours of duty. Wow. My new store had only been open for 3 days when all hell broke loose. Tim and Susan arrived in a cloud of dust, and you could hear them cursing and yelling as they got out of the car. My customers stood and watched them cursing at me. Tim had a tire iron with him, and I was afraid he was going to try to use it. I guess Sally was worried too because she called the sheriff. We were lucky there was a car nearby, and he arrived before we could strike. The next few weeks after my confrontation with Tim and Susan were difficult. We received several nuisance phone calls that we thought were coming from Tim and Susan. Tim was complaining very loudly about my new venture all over town. By the end of the first summer of my business, I was making a nice profit and had a pretty large customer base. If I were to guess, I'd say I had taken about half of Tim's business away from me. Whenever I saw Tim or Susan in town, if looks could kill, I'd definitely be dead. Another drawback to the store was its effect on my children, or rather, my ability to be with them. Susan refused to let them in for a month after I first opened the store. I finally had to go to a divorce attorney, and he threatened to sue if they wouldn't let me see the kids again. They grudgingly allowed me to see the kids, but for a while they stuck to the exact letter of the original custody agreement. Things finally changed after Jessica moved on to middle school. She needed help with math or she might fail the subject. Her mother and Tim struggled to balance their checkbooks, even though they both had college degrees. The bookkeeper and accountant kept all the business records. My college major and love of math made me a great source of homework help. I helped Jessica whenever I had dates, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, Susan reluctantly allowed Jessica and then Alex to spend many evenings and even nights with me getting help with school assignments. At the same time, Susan made it clear that my overnight stays had no bearing on her child support payments. As time went on, Jessica and Alex started bringing friends over for help and tutoring. I loved having the kids close to home and loved seeing the light in their eyes as they grasped a concept. I was so proud when the children I helped would come to the store or to my house after receiving their report cards and show me their grades. Most of the children I helped got A's or B's in the subjects we discussed. In math, everyone got A's. I noticed more and more often that I was stopped in town by the parents of one of my kids. They all told me how much they appreciated my help and friendship. Life became fun again. Jessica was 17 in the fall, a junior in high school, and Alex was 16 and a sophomore. Both kids seemed more and more unhappy. They were spending more and more time at my house asking for help with their schoolwork. I could tell they really understood the subject matter when they came to me for help. Finally, in February, I fell silent and demanded an explanation of what was wrong. Jessica sat with her hands in her lap, then sighed and looked at Alex. Jessica took a deep breath and began to speak through a sniffle. "Daddy, if we are at Tim's house, we have to be quiet. We have to keep the whole house clean and cook almost everything. Mommy says we owe them because they both work so hard at the store to set up such a nice place for us to live. If we are home and Tim and Mom want to go somewhere, they just tell us to watch George, Tim and Susan's son, and leave. We never know when they will be back. Most of the time they are gone for the night or a day or two. We have to stay in our rooms when Tim and Mom's friends from the big city come to visit. It feels like they are ashamed of us. They always go out to eat or to parties, and we hardly ever go. When we stay here, you don't make us do anything you can help us with. We laugh and tell jokes. We watch TV, and sometimes you take us out to eat or just for a walk. You let us invite our friends over, and we can laugh as loud as we want and listen to our music. Oh, Daddy, I wish we never had to leave our home. I know, we so wish we could come back here and live. We miss him and you so much." After calming the kids down, I helped them finish their homework and reluctantly sent them back to their mother. When they left, I sat and thought about them and their problem. How I hated what had happened to my children and my life. The next morning, I called the attorney who handled the divorce case. He said that the children were old enough to decide where they wanted to live, and if the court agreed, they could move back home. One of the perks of that would be an early termination of child support. I told him to start working on the problem and filing paperwork. The next time the children came to see me, I told them what the lawyer had said. They looked so happy when I told them about it. I tearfully hugged them when I told them that I had instructed the lawyer to file for custody of them. Jessica and Alex looked like the weight of the world had been lifted off their shoulders. Jessica cried and turned to Alex. She said, "See, Alex? I told you that Mom and Tim were wrong. I told you that Daddy loved us and would let us live with him again." They both came over to me and we hugged. Jessica then told me that a few months ago she and Alex had asked Susan if they could live with me, and she had told them no. She said I didn't want them underfoot all the time, and besides, she and Tim needed money for child support. She said, "Besides, children should be with their mother, not with some man who lives happily like your father." Needless to say, the custody hearing was unpleasant. The attorney did his homework well. He had assigned a private investigator to keep an eye on Tim and Susan and document the times they were away, leaving all three children to fend for themselves. Jessica was old enough to be left alone, but it was a little dubious to assign her the care of the two boys for such long periods of time when she stayed with them. In addition, the judge listened to the children's wishes. He ruled that they would be allowed to return to my home. I think we were all shocked when the judge ordered child support services to monitor the home life of Susan and Tim's son George. Susan was furious. She was screaming and yelling in court, and then Tim came up to me and said, "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you, Trump? You just had to set Susan up and get us in trouble again, didn't you? Wasn't it enough to ruin my business and chances for the house?" And walked away. The children settled into the house, and in the summer, it was such a delight to hear the children bathing and playing in the old swimming hole day after day. I think we had half the children in town gathered at one time or another. I noticed that the same three boys often attended when Jessica was home, and Alex's core group of 16-year-old kids did too. The Saturday before Thanksgiving. I was sitting on my porch in the middle of the afternoon, and I heard and then saw an older car coming down the dead-end road toward my house. They drove past the store and I realized this was not a business. I wondered who it was and got a little annoyed because every now and then people try to drive through my field to get to the road on the other side. The road has been closed for over 30 years because the creek changed its course and eroded it. But people still want to drive through and try to drive through my field. I sat and watched as the car stopped in front of the house and a very beautiful woman in her 30s got out. I realized that I had never seen her or the car before. As she approached the porch, she looked up at me and asked in her most pleasant voice, "Are you Mr. John Stevens?" I nodded and then said, "Yes. How can I help you?" I really hoped it wasn't some salesman or Bible scholar. The woman gave me a beautiful smile and said, "I'm Melody Harris, the math teacher at this school. For the past 3 years, I have had a group of students who are doing much better than their peers. Every once in a while, students who were struggling to get C's start getting A's or B's. I have found that all of these students are friends of your children. I talked to them and your daughter and found out that you were to blame for the improvement in my test scores and decided that I needed to meet with my aide. I think your daughter and her friends were afraid you'd get in trouble for helping them. They were very reluctant to tell me who was doing my work for me. I sat there for a moment in shock and then jumped up when I heard Jessica exclaim, 'Miss Harris! What are you doing here?' Relax, Jessica. I was checking papers this afternoon, and once again, you and your friends did much better than the other members of your class. I decided that I needed to finally meet with your father. Since I needed a break, I decided to see if I could see him today. Coming to my senses, I stammered, 'Miss Harris, I apologize for my daughters and my bad manners. Would you like to sit down? We can sit here or we can go inside.' Jessica, would you please bring me a glass of tea and anything else Miss Harris desires?" Melody replied, "Thank you, Mr. Stevens. I really like the view from your porch. Would you mind if we sat here during our visit?" "Oh, I'm sorry, Jessica. Tea will be fine for me too," she said. I said, "Miss Harris." Miss Harris interrupted my sentence and said, "A tune, please, Mr. Stevens." I smiled and said, "Okay, Melody. Thank you. I agree. The view from the porch and my patio is worth every dime spent building them. And my name is John." After Jessica brought tea, Melody and I talked about the children and the help I was giving them. She was impressed with my major in math and my desire to help children. "But what about the rest of your life? From what the kids tell me, you do homework 2 or 3 days a week and on Saturday nights. You run a farm store and a big farm. Your wife doesn't," here she blushed. "Oh, I'm sorry. How rude of me. I forgot. I heard what happened. Oh." Then she jumped up and headed for her car. I jumped up and grabbed her as she was already starting to get into the car. "Melody, please wait. It's okay. I know what you mean and I'm not upset. Now please go back and finish your tea. I might get upset if you leave early." She stared at me for a minute, still blushing, then let me lead her to the porch. "John, I'm so sorry. I know how you feel. I lost my husband in the war, and I've put all my care and life into these children, just like you. I keep hoping to start a real life and find someone, but there's just no one here I'm interested in. Is that your problem too?" I started to get frustrated with her intrusiveness, but then I thought, did I really? After all, she hadn't said anything that I didn't think about the male reserve of my favorite hometown. I looked back at Melody and saw tears streaming down her cheeks. I walked over to her chair and knelt down next to her and then said, "Shh, Melody, it's long in the past. If you want to tell me about it, I'd love to hear you out, but you really need to get over it." She looked at me and said, "We had only been married 18 months when Jason died. He was a Navy helicopter pilot and didn't return from his first combat mission. We wanted to have children, but we didn't have time to start a family. I dove headfirst into my studies, and when I found this job opening here, far from the coast and bad memories, I accepted. I've dated some, but other than a few nice men, I haven't found anyone to share my future with. I understand how you feel. I'm just thankful for the kids I'm raising in school. I think we knew all the same people. I knew the problems and idiosyncrasies of the men she dated, and she laughingly told me about the mores and problems of the women I dated. We had a good laugh reminiscing about dating. We discovered that neither of us liked the bar scene in the nearest major city, 45 miles away, and neither of our friends had anyone acceptable to set us up with. Melody was impressed that I am still in the reserves, have already become a major and may soon be promoted to lieutenant colonel. I now have 22 years of total service and am trying to decide whether or not to retire. I explained that Sean and Sally had long ago taken over 98% of the work at the store. They and the other hired help made me redundant, so since there was nothing keeping me home, I took many short tours of active duty in the reserves. I also explained that these short tours of duty stopped when the kids started living with me again. I considered retiring solely to be home with the kids and not have to worry about being deployed again if the Army needed me. Dusk descended and we were still talking. My stomach rumbled, then Melody's. She blushed and apologized. She said she had to go. I haven't had lunch and I really need to eat dinner. I said, I have enjoyed our conversation very much. Why don't you let me take you out to dinner in town? The kids have dates and otherwise I would be here alone. We could go to a cafe and continue our conversation over dinner. No, John, I really can't. I can't believe I kept you all day. I'm really sorry for tearing you away from your work, she said. I looked at Melody and I thought I saw a flicker of longing in her eyes. Melody, if you really don't want to come with me, fine. But if you're worried about imposing, forget it. I'm enjoying this day more than any other day I can remember since I got back from Iraq 6 years ago, and I really don't want it to end. Melody looked at me, then licked her lips and said, Okay, John. I really like talking to you too, so let's do it. I smiled and said, Great. Do you need to go home first, or can we just take my car and drive from here? Oh, I'm not dressed to go now. I need to shower and change, she said. I laughed and said, Okay. If you want to clean up, fine, but remember where we're going. I bet half the people there will have manure on their clothes, and from the cafe, they'll go straight to the barn or the field. You look all right to me, but we can do it your way if you want. Melody looked shocked, then laughed. John, when you're right, you're right. Let's go. She took my hand and we walked. I can't remember when I've enjoyed a meal more. I almost didn't get to eat. It seemed like everyone we knew kept coming over to the table to look at us and talk. By the time we left the cafe, it was closing time, 9 p.m., and I managed to talk Melody into stopping by my house for some wine when we got back. We were sitting together on the couch at 1 o'clock in the morning when Jessica returned from her date. Dad. Miss Harris. Me! Then she blushed, looked at her companion and said, We didn't think you'd still be on your feet. When Jessica realized what she was implying, she groaned, covered her mouth with her hand, and ran off to her room. I looked at the very shocked young man and the teacher, then smiled. Excuse me, I said. I think I need to talk to Jess. Why don't you both sit here while I sort this out? Jess cried when I knocked and entered her room. She threw herself into my arms and said, Oh, Daddy. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to say that, and I'm so sorry for interrupting. I kissed her and told her it was okay, and then asked her to go back to the family room. When she saw Melody, she blushed again and said, I'm sorry, Miss Harris. I really didn't mean what I sounded. I was just so surprised that you were still here. Melody replied, It's okay, Jessica. I know what you meant, and what you said doesn't bother me. I'm sorry we interrupted your time with Nathan. Melody looked at me and said, John, I really have to go. I don't know when I've had such a good time. I got up and walked her to her car. As she started to close the door, I grabbed her and asked her, Melody, can I call you? Could we do this again? My heart raced and my stomach fluttered as she smiled and said, Oh, please. I'd really like that. That's how it all started. Melody and I started dating and discovered that we were, as they say, soulmates. I felt much better with her than I did with Susan. At times, I wondered what I even saw in Susan, especially after she'd gotten so nasty during and after the divorce. As the months progressed, I fell more and more under the spell cast by Melody. We enjoyed going into town for good food and attending the many local and school events. The world seemed brighter now. Melody appeared to me to be an exciting and sensual woman. Since Thanksgiving, I'd been with Melody every minute I could get my mind off the farm and she off her work. On Valentine's Day, we went out for a candlelight dinner. When we got back to my house, I finally learned how passionate Melody was. I had suspected she was a passionate woman for months, but until this night, the most I had gotten was her wonderful kisses and a few feels of her gorgeous breasts outside of her clothes. Both kids had dates, and I escorted Melody to my house. Her simple red silk dress was stunning. It fit her like a second skin. The skirt was full and fluttered delightfully as she walked. She wasn't wearing a bra, and I couldn't take my eyes off her very prominent nipples. They were almost peeking out of the bodice of the dress. We sat on my couch staring into the fireplace, sipping wine and talking. We kissed. I still remember her whispering. She whispered, "I love you, John. There will always be a special place in my heart for Jason, but I love you very much." I was so shocked, and then I felt my chest heave. I leaned over to kiss Melody one more time and said, "I love you too, Melody. I've been afraid to tell you this for the past 2 months, but I think I already love you more than I ever loved Susan." It was the first time Melody had spent the whole night at my house. It was also the first time we had sex. We were both embarrassed the next morning when we had to stand in front of my kids. In hindsight, it's funny, but not that morning. I got up early to make my morning coffee and was sitting on the patio when Melody came out to join me for a cup. She reached into my closet and put on one of my old sweatshirts. It hung down to about halfway down her thighs, and I quickly discovered that was all she was wearing. We were sitting on the swing and cuddling, enjoying the rising sun, each other, and coffee. We were exchanging tender, loving kisses and thinking of nothing else when we heard a sigh behind us. "Oh, I didn't know. I'm sorry," we heard in Jessica's voice. Then we heard quick footsteps and the sound of the door closing. I started to get up and Melody put her hand on my shoulder. She gave me a quick smack and said, "No, John. This is my fault, and I think I should handle it for you if you don't mind." She got up and left for the house before I could say anything back, so I stayed where I was, hoping it would all work out in the end. Melody had been gone for about 30 minutes, and I was starting to worry when she returned to the patio with a fresh cup of coffee and still wearing my old shirt. "Holy shit, she was hot!" Following her, Jessica appeared with a puzzled look on her face. A small smile appeared on her face as she leaned over to kiss my cheek. "Good morning, Daddy," she whispered. Melody didn't leave until almost 2 in the afternoon that day. She and Jessica had never told me what they'd discussed that morning, but I'd noticed that they seemed more relaxed around each other since then. They seemed more like girlfriends with a little bit of mother and daughter thrown in. Be that as it may, I was pleased. I was even more pleased when Jessica came up to me after Melody left and said, "I'm so happy for both of you, Daddy." I think we knew we were getting married since Valentine's Day, but I had been waiting to officially ask Melody to be my wife at the Memorial Day party. Once again, she spent the night with me to help with the preparations. That morning, before breakfast or starting lunch, we sat on my patio. I turned to Melody and said, "Mel, you look like you belong here. I feel so complete sharing my patio and home with you. You look so happy and content as we sit here and watch the sun come up over the creek and burn off the fog. I don't know what I would do without you in my life. Ever since you came into my life, I feel complete again." Melody looked at me cheerfully, almost expectantly, and then sort of pulled away when I didn't say anything else. Finally, she said, "John, I too feel fulfilled and complete when I'm with you. I love being with you anywhere, but I especially feel it here, in your house, with you." I thought tears appeared in her eyes as I smiled and said, "Good. I'm so glad you feel that way." I didn't say anything else, but I felt like a bit of an asshole when I just stood up, kissed her gently on the lips and said, "So, shall we start the day?" That day before the meal was served, I gathered all my friends and asked Melody to come up to me. I said, "You all know Melody by now and you know how wonderful she is. I want to let you know that she is responsible for almost all of this wonderful meal. She is responsible for the sunshine and happiness we share here today. I told her this morning that she looks like she belongs here, that I feel complete when she is here." Melody told me that she felt complete and content here with me. I think she was waiting for me to say something else, but I didn't. I felt Melody tense up as I pulled her closer to me, wrapping my arms around her waist. I turned to her and said, "Melody, I think I offended you this morning, but I wanted to test your feelings about me and my life one more time before I ask you in front of all of our friends to share the rest of our lives together. Melody, will you marry me?" As I asked the question, I looked Melody straight in the eye. There was a murmur through the crowd as I reached into my pocket and pulled out a ring. I held it out to Melody and was so happy when she raised her left hand. There were tears in her eyes as she whispered, "Yes, yes, 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 John. I've been dreaming of you asking me to marry you ever since Valentine's Day." Now I stood looking at my daughter, who was standing at the church altar across from me. I was reflecting on the twists and turns we take in life and not paying attention to what was happening around me. I heard a murmur and the music came on. Mendelssohn's Wedding March. I turned as I heard the guests getting up and looked toward the back of the church. A beautiful vision was walking down the aisle, hand in hand with my father. This was my love, my life, my future wife, Melody. I guess you could say Melody was now living in my heart again. It was hard to believe that it had only been 9 months since she had moved into my yard and into my heart. The years flew by so quickly. Jessica graduated from college and got married. She and her husband took over the management of the farm store. A few years ago, Tim and Susan were forced to close their store due to lack of business. I bought the buildings from the bank and moved my store back to town. After Sean died, Sally couldn't handle it. Alex is a lieutenant in the Army and has a very serious crush on the daughter of a senior officer. I'm sitting on the patio again in the Indian summer sunshine with my favorite morning beverage, coffee. A giggle comes from the kitchen, and I turn to see my daughter bringing my new grandson John through the door. She knelt down beside me and held out my first grandchild to me. I was looking at the most perfect little face and hands when a hand lay on my shoulder and a face showed. A gentle kiss was placed on my lips. I felt a chill run through me as my mind once again traveled down the years-long road back to the memories I had suppressed so long ago. For a moment, I remember Susan doing the same thing. Melody looks at me in shock and I recoil slightly, but she relaxes as I reach for her neck and pull her to me for a kiss. When we part, she stands up and looks at me with a question on her face. Honey, when you did that, I remembered when Susan and I were first married. She would put her hand on my shoulder and lean over to kiss me like you did. I sat there and cried, wondering if I would ever have someone in my life who would do that to me. Now I am so happy that I can answer yes to that question. Yes, I have someone to do this for me again, and now everything is so much better. When I finished, I saw tears in Melody's eyes, and then I heard Jessica crying softly. I turned to her and she put her hand on my knee and said, Daddy, I know Mommy hurt you a lot, but I'm so happy for you now. Life was really good again. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.